They found the hand first. It broke through the surface of the snow at 0340, 2 hours on a February morning. The temperature had settled at 71 degrees below zero. It was the kind of cold that does not announce itself with wind or drama. It simply exists. Absolute, impatient. A cold that waits for living things to make one single, fatal mistake. The gloved hand was small, pale against the white chaos of the Brooks Range in Alaska. The fingers were not relaxed in the slackness of death. They were locked around something dark and angular. The Navy SEAL medic who saw it first stopped walking. He held up his fist. The rescue team behind him halted in perfect, silent synchronicity. Nobody spoke. The Brooks Range is not interested in human conversation. It holds a silence that predates the first man to cross the ice. It will hold that silence long after the last aircraft stops flying over its peaks. The mountains stand white and enormous against a sky the color of old steel. They do not care what happens in the small spaces between their ridgelines. The medic knelt in the snow. He cleared the surface carefully. He moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this before, who has found things in the snow that should not be there. The hand became a wrist. The wrist became a forearm. The dark thing the fingers held became visible in sections. A stock, a barrel, a scope housing. It caught the weak pre-dawn light. It was not a modern rifle. There was no polymer, no rails, no laser rangefinders or digital atmospheric sensors. It was old metal and worn wood. A weapon from another era. Something with weight and history. A permanence that newer equipment tries to approximate but never achieves. The medic put 2 fingers against the visible wrist. He held his breath. Behind him, the other operators stood in a half circle, their headlamps cutting pale columns through the gloom. Nobody moved. Nobody checked their watches. They did not do the small things people do when they are standing in 71 below zero and trying not to think about what that cold does to human tissue over time. The medic looked up. His face was complicated, not surprise, not relief, something in between. He had just encountered information that did not fit the pattern of survival. Alive, he said. The words came out flat, factual, the way all important information comes out in the field. No drama, no inflection. He did not wait for a response. He was already clearing more snow, exposing more of the figure beneath. Shoulders, neck, the side of a face so pale it was almost translucent, but it had the specific quality of living flesh rather than frozen meat. She lay on her side in a shallow trench. The trench was dug with precision, not random, not panicked. This was a shelter built by someone who understood the brutal mathematics of survival. Depth matters. Wall angle matters. Every choice you make in the first 10 minutes of a cold emergency determines whether you see the sunrise. She was still holding the rifle, her fingers locked around it in a grip that looked carved from stone. The rifle lay along her body, parallel to her spine. Even in her current state, deeply hypothermic, severely injured, hovering on the exact knife edge of death, she had maintained contact with it. In 71 below zero, after what must have been at least 31 hours of exposure, this woman's fingers were still locked around a weapon with a kind of grip that does not come from fear. It comes from training, deep training. The kind of iron discipline that survives when everything else is gone. Warmth, hope, the basic assumption that you will live to see tomorrow. 48 hours earlier, the C-130 Hercules touched down at Eielson Air Force Base. 7:15 on a Tuesday. The sun was not up. It would not be up for another hour. This far north in winter, the sun behaves like an optional guest. Someone who shows up late, leaves early, and cannot be relied upon for anything important. The temperature on the tarmac was 38 degrees below zero. Sergeant Kaylin Rourke stepped off the aircraft. The air hit her lungs like a solid block of ice. She had known cold before, But this was different. This was the kind of cold that makes you understand immediately that you are in a place not designed for human habitation. A place that tolerates your presence only until you show weakness. She carried her own gear, all of it. The heavy medical rucksack, the trauma kit, and the weathered tan canvas case that held the rifle. That one she carried with particular care. Both hands, the way you carry something that matters more than its physical weight. Nobody offered to help. That was fine. She did not expect help. She had stopped expecting help years ago. She was a woman in a world of hardened men, carrying a legacy she had not asked for, but refused to abandon. The terminal building was aggressively warm, as if the heating system was engaged in active combat with the air outside. Kaylin found the sign for the briefing room. She followed the corridor, her boots making the steady, rhythmic sound of someone who has walked enough miles to have broken them in properly. She arrived 4 minutes early. She set her gear in the corner. Rucksack first, medical kit on top, rifle case laid carefully beside them. She took a seat at the far end of the conference table, where she could see the door and the map board. Territory matters in rooms like this. Small choices about where you sit communicate things. Kaylin folded her hands on the table and waited. At exactly 800, the door opened. The first man through was broad across the shoulders, with close-cut blonde hair and a face that settled naturally into an expression of mild, persistent skepticism. Captain Thaddeus Vance. He wore the uniform perfectly, creases sharp, fit exact. He moved with the confidence of an officer who believed profoundly in his own superiority, and more importantly, in the superiority of the technology he commanded. His eyes swept the room, registered Kaylin's presence, and did something complicated. A micro-expression that suggested he was processing a flaw in his environment. He took a seat. 2 more came in. Private Corbin Hayes, young and alert, radiating the anxious energy of a soldier on his first real deployment. Behind him walked an older man in civilian cold-weather gear, Dr. Aldous Kepler, a geologist for the United States government, 64 years old, with eyes that had spent decades looking at rocks and ice. The last man to enter brought a different kind of silence into the room. Silas McAfee, 62 years old, built like a brick wall that had survived an earthquake. He carried no rank insignia, functioning as a civilian advisor, but everyone in the room knew who he was. A veteran of the Cold War, a sniper who had operated in the shadows of the Berlin Wall and the jungles of Central America. His face was a map of scars and sun damage. He moved with the slow deliberateness of a man who knows exactly how dangerous he is. McAfee's dark eyes locked onto Kaylin. Then they drifted to the weathered canvas case in the corner. A faint, almost imperceptible nod of recognition passed between them. McAfee had known her father. Captain Vance stood at the head of the table. He activated the digital map board with a tap of his smart tablet. 10-day reconnaissance patrol into the Brooks Range, Vance said. His voice was crisp, tailored for command. Primary objective is geological surveying of a newly exposed glacial trench with Dr. Kepler. Secondary objective is route mapping. We depart at 0600. Vance looked around the table. He outlined the marching order, the communications protocols, the satellite uplinks, the drone coverage. He spoke of algorithms and digital thermal overlays with a religious reverence. Then his eyes fell on Kaylin. Sergeant Rourke, Vance said, medical support. Yes, sir, Kaylin replied. Her voice was level, flat. Vance gestured toward the corner of the room, toward the canvas case. Medical support bringing personal weapons on a standard recon patrol. He made it sound like an insult. What is in the case, Sergeant? Personal equipment, sir, Kaylin said, within regulation parameters. Vance scoffed. He tapped his chest rig. The modern combat rifle slung across his back was a marvel of engineering. It had a ballistic computer built into the optic. It calculated windage, elevation, barometric pressure, and spindrift in a fraction of a second. It was a weapon that did the thinking for the shooter. "We are operating with standard-issue networked optics, Rourke," Vance said. "I do not want any analog cowboys on my team. If that is a hunting rifle, leave it in the armory. We have drone overwatch. We do not need relics." Kaylin looked at Vance. She did not blink. "With respect, Captain, batteries die." Vance's jaw tightened. "Not on my watch, they do not." The briefing ended. The men filed out. Kaylin stayed behind to gather her gear. Silas McAfee lingered near the door. He waited until Vance and the others were gone. He walked over to the canvas case. He did not touch it, but he looked at it with the reverence one might reserve for a holy relic. "M24 Sniper Weapon System," McAfee said. His voice was gravel grinding over stone. 1991 vintage, 7.62 millimeter, worn wood, free-floating stainless barrel. "Yes, sir," Kaylin said. McAfee looked at her. He had eyes that cut through pretense. "Jonathan Lockwood's rifle." "Your father's." Kaylin stood a little straighter. "He taught me how to shoot it." "I know he did," McAfee said softly. "I was his spotter in Kuwait. I saw him make a 1,000-yard shot in a sandstorm, using nothing but a dope book and a feeling in his gut. He was iron, and he passed that iron to you." McAfee looked toward the door where Vance had exited. "The captain trusts the satellites. He trusts the microchips. He has never been in a place where the sky goes dark and the machines stop talking." McAfee turned his gaze back to Kaylin. "Keep the rifle, girl. The Brooks Range does not care about microchips." The first 3 days in the mountains were a brutal lesson in movement. It was not tactical movement. It was just the fundamental physics of putting one foot in front of the other when the ground beneath you is inconsistent. The air temperature is low enough to make your lungs bleed, and every piece of equipment feels like it weighs twice its actual mass. They moved in a staggered column. Vance took point, his eyes glued to the digital map on his chest tablet. Hayes followed, struggling to maintain the grueling pace. Dr. Kepler moved with surprising endurance for a man his age, his eyes constantly scanning the rock formations protruding from the ice. Kaylin stayed near the rear, watching the way the men moved. As a medic, she observed the micro-adjustments in their gaits, the way Hayes favored his left knee, the way Vance breathed just a little too hard on the inclines. McAfee walked beside Kaylin. He did not look at a screen. He looked at the sky. He looked at the way the winds shaped the snowdrifts. He was reading the earth. On the afternoon of the third day, the temperature plummeted to -45. The sky turned a flat, dead gray. "Doctor." Kepler had wandered slightly off the main trail, examining a deep fissure in the ice wall. Suddenly, he raised his hand. "Captain, over here." Vance sighed, checking his tablet. "Doctor, we are off the designated route. The drone coverage is spotty in this ravine." Kepler did not move. "You need to see this, Captain. This is not geological." The team converged on the fissure. Buried deep within the ice, partially exposed by a recent shift in the glacier, was a structure. It was made of hardened concrete and thick, rust-proof steel. Heavy cables ran from a sealed blast door into the permafrost. Vance wiped the frost from his visor. "What the hell is this? It is not on any of the satellite maps." McAfee stepped forward. He ran his gloved hand over the steel door. He found a faded, stenciled emblem beneath a layer of rime ice. A red star, a hammer and sickle. "It is Soviet," McAfee said quietly. "A Cold War listening post, probably buried since the late 80s. The glacier shifted and pushed it up." Vance tapped his radio. "Base, this is Recon 1. We have located an uncharted foreign installation, requesting immediate uplift of data and..." The air did not just break. It shattered. It started with a low, electromagnetic hum that vibrated in the fillings of their teeth, a sound you felt in your bones before you heard it with your ears. Then, the digital world died. Vance was looking down at his chest-mounted tactical tablet when the screen stuttered, flared a violent, sickly green, and went entirely black. His radio emitted a sharp squeal and went dead. The thermal imaging overlays on his smart optic powered down with a pathetic whine. "What happened?" Hayes panicked, slapping the side of his helmet. "My comms are down. My optic is black." "EMP!" McAfee roared, diving for the cover of an ice boulder. "Electromagnetic pulse. Get down." The silence that followed the EMP lasted less than a second. Then the valley erupted. The first round hit Private Corbin Hayes high in the right thigh. The impact lifted the young man off his feet and threw him backward into a snowbank. The sound of the gunshot arrived a second later, a heavy, suppressed thump from the high ridge to the east. They were blind, they were deaf, and they were trapped in a kill zone. Vance dropped to the snow. He pulled the trigger on his smart rifle. Nothing happened. The electronic firing mechanism was locked out by the EMP failsafe. The weapon was a 30-pound brick of useless polymer and aluminum. "We cannot return fire," Vance screamed. His arrogance had evaporated instantly, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. The technology had failed him, and he had nothing left to fall back on. Hayes was screaming. It was not a sound of pain yet. It was the sound of profound, sudden terror. The human body realizing it is leaking its life onto the ice. Kaylin Rourke moved. She did not wait for an order. She did not check a screen. While Vance was still slapping his dead rifle, Kaylin was already low-crawling across the exposed slope. The snow kicked up around her face as a second sniper round bit into the frozen earth, inches from her shoulder. She did not flinch. She did not pause. The geometry of the battlefield was simple, and she accepted it. She reached Hayes. The blood was wrong. It was too bright. Arterial. In 45 degrees below zero, blood does not flow like liquid for long. It steams. It thickens. It freezes into a horrific, dark slush. Hayes had a severed femoral artery. A human being can bleed out from a femoral wound in 3 minutes in a warm room. In this extreme cold, the shock would stop his heart in 2. Kaylin put her knee directly into his groin, pinning the artery against the pelvic bone with her full body weight. Hayes thrashed. His eyes were wide, unseeing. "Hold still, Corbin." Her voice was flat. It carried no panic. It was the voice of a mechanic diagnosing an engine. It cut through his terror precisely because it refused to acknowledge it. She ripped the medical shears from her vest, cut away the layered tactical fabric. The wound channeled deep into the muscle. She did not use the high-tech coagulant foam that required a battery-operated heating wand to activate. She reached for the old gear. A Generation 7 mechanical tourniquet, nylon and a hardened plastic windlass. It did not need a battery, it needed a strong hand. She routed the band high and tight. She twisted the windlass. 1 rotation, 2, 3. Hayes let out a strangled gasp as the pressure crushed his muscle down to the bone. The arterial spurting stopped. Kaylin locked the rod into the clip. She noted the time on her analog wristwatch. The hands glowed with tritium. Old technology. Reliable. Vance crawled up beside her. His face was chalk white. "Who is shooting at us?" "The Red Wolves," McAfee said from behind his rock. "Remnants of Spetsnaz. They operate off the grid. They must have come to recover whatever is inside that bunker. They hit us with a localized EMP to blind our overwatch. 2 shooters," McAfee continued, his eyes scanning the eastern ridge without the aid of binoculars. "Elevation positive 200 feet, distance approximately 800 yards. They are using passive optics. They know we cannot shoot back." "We are dead," Vance whispered. "We cannot call for air. Our guns are bricked." Kaylin finished packing Hayes' wound with dry hemostatic gauze. She secured the pressure dressing. She looked at Hayes' pale face. He was stable. For now. She turned to Vance. "Keep your hand on this dressing. Apply 60 pounds of pressure. Do not move." "Rourke, what are you doing?" Vance demanded. Kaylin did not answer. She rolled away from the wounded boy and moved back to her pack. She pulled the weathered tan canvas case free. The canvas was stiff with the cold. Vance watched her unlatch the brass buckles. "Rourke, that is a museum piece," he hissed over the sound of the wind. "The smart scopes are dead. You cannot hit a target at 800 yards without a ballistic computer. The crosswinds are 20 knots. Kaylin opened the case. The M24 sniper weapon system lay inside. The stock was a composite of Kevlar, graphite, and fiberglass, worn smooth where her father's cheek had rested, where her cheek now rested. The optic was a Leupold Mark IV, glass in reticles. No wires, no circuit boards, no software to hack. It was not a weapon that did the thinking for you. It was a weapon that required you to be the computer. She lifted the rifle. It felt heavy. It felt like home. She racked the bolt. The metallic clack-clack was sharp and clean in the frigid air. A round slid into the chamber. She moved to the edge of the granite outcropping. She deployed the bipod. She lay down in the snow, settling her body into the firing position her father had taught her on a windy hill in Montana. Left hand supporting the rear of the stock, right hand gripping the pistol grip, bone support, muscle relaxation, natural point of aim. Silas McAfee watched her. The old man's eyes narrowed in deep, silent approval. He knew what she was doing. He was witnessing a resurrection of the old ways. Kaylin put her eye to the scope. The world narrowed to a circle of magnified glass. She scanned the eastern ridge. No thermal signatures to guide her. She had to look for the things the old snipers look for. A disruption in the snow pattern. A shadow that did not belong to a rock. The slight, almost imperceptible mist of human breath hanging in the sub-zero air. She found them. Two shapes tucked into a crease in the rock face. 800 yards. Now came the math. The kind of math that lives in the blood, not in a microchip. Distance, 800 yards. Elevation, upward angle of 12 degrees. Temperature, -45 Fahrenheit. Extreme cold means extreme dense air. Dense air creates more drag on the bullet. The powder inside the brass casing would burn slower, reducing muzzle velocity. A smart rifle would calculate this instantly. Kaylin calculated it by knowing her weapon intimately. She mentally added 3 minutes of angle to her elevation dial to compensate for the drop. Her gloved fingers found the turret and clicked it into place. Wind, the hardest part. She did not have a digital anemometer. She opened her left eye, keeping her right eye in the scope. She watched the spin drift, the fine, powdery snow blowing off the ridge. She watched the angle of the fall. She watched the mirage near the rocks. Wind from the northwest. A full-value crosswind pushing left to right. 15 to 18 miles per hour, gusting to 22. She held the crosshairs into the wind. 2.5 mils left. Vance was watching her. He was watching the impossibility of what she was attempting. "You cannot make that shot," he breathed. Kaylin tuned him out. She tuned the cold out. She tuned the fear out. She focused entirely on her breathing. Deep inhale, slow exhale, the natural respiratory pause. That brief, silent void at the bottom of a breath where the human body is perfectly still. She found the void. Her finger applied 3 pounds of pressure to the trigger. The M24 fired. The recoil punched her shoulder. The rifle barked, a sharp, concussive blast that echoed off the valley walls. Kaylin did not lose her sight picture. She watched the trace of the bullet. A tiny distortion in the air rushing toward the ridge. 800 yards takes a bullet almost a full second to travel. Through the scope, the left shape on the ridge jerked violently backward. A spray of dark mist painted the white snow behind him. Target down. Kaylin worked the bolt. Back, forward, smooth, fast. The spent brass casing ejected, tumbling hot onto the ice. A fresh round chambered. The second sniper was moving. Panic. He was trying to shift position, realizing his invisible cloak meant nothing to whoever was returning fire. He was scrambling across a gap in the rocks. Kaylin tracked him. She adjusted her lead, moving target, cold air. She held a half-mil ahead of his path. She breathed. She found the void. She fired. The rifle kicked. The brass flew. The second shape crumpled mid-stride, dropping like a puppet with its strings cut. He slid down the snowy embankment and lay still. The ridge went silent. Kaylin stayed on the scope for 10 full seconds, watching, waiting. Nothing moved. She clicked the safety on. She slowly lowered the rifle. Vance was staring at her. His mouth was slightly open. The tablet on his chest was still a dead piece of black plastic. The smart rifle slung across his back was a useless club. He looked at Kaylin, and then he looked at the wooden stock of the M24. The arrogance in his eyes had been completely fractured by the undeniable reality of superior human skill. 2 targets, Silas McAfee said. His voice was gravel and deep satisfaction. 2 hits. Excellent win call, Sergeant. Your father would have noted you were a fraction slow on the bolt manipulation, but the result speaks for itself. Kaylin did not smile. She stood up. We need to move. The EMP means their main element knows we are blind. They will send a sweep team. We have to get Hayes to an extraction zone. Vance shook his head, trying to clear the shock. Comms are down. We cannot call in LZ. McAfee reached into his deep parka pocket. He pulled out a bulky, rectangular radio. It looked like a brick from the 1980s. High-frequency shortwave, vacuum tubes, hardened against EMP. He pulled the long metal antenna out. Base, this is Grizzly 6. Broken Arrow, we have contact. We have wounded. Requesting immediate evac at Rally Point Delta. The radio hissed. Then a voice cut through the static. Grizzly 6, this is Base. We read you. Be advised, meteorological confirms a Category 5 blizzard rolling over the Brooks Range. You have a massive pressure drop inbound. Flight window is closing rapidly. We are sending an MH-60 now. You have exactly 40 minutes to reach Delta. Once the bird touches down, you have a 6-minute window before the weather grounds them permanently. After that, no one is flying for 3 days. McAfee looked at Kaylin. 40 minutes. It is a 2-mile hump through deep snow with a wounded man. We can make it, Kaylin said. She knelt next to Hayes. The young private was pale, shivering violently. Blood loss and cold. A deadly combination. Vance, grab his other shoulder. We carry him. They moved. The progression was agonizing. Every step in the deep snow required a deliberate effort. The wind was picking up. The gray-white sky was lowering, pressing down on them like a physical weight. The temperature was dropping steadily. -48, -50. Half a mile from the extraction zone, the terrain dipped into a shallow ravine. It was here that Kaylin saw the anomaly. Hold, she commanded. Vance grunted, struggling under Hayes' weight. What? We cannot stop, Rourke. The clock is ticking. Kaylin pointed. 50 yards off the trail, near the base of a massive ice wall, there was a shape. It was partially covered by drifting snow, but the bright orange fabric of a civilian extreme weather parka was unmistakable. Dr. Kepler. In the chaos of the ambush, in the EMP, the old geologist had been separated from the group. McAfee saw it too. He unslung his weapon, moving cautiously toward the shape. Kaylin followed, leaving Vance to support Hayes. They brushed the snow away. It was Kepler. His face was a map of deep lines, frost clinging to his eyebrows and beard. He was breathing, but barely. His right leg was pinned beneath a heavy slab of fallen ice. The angle of the bone was grotesque, a compound fracture of the tibia. Kaylin dug her hand into his collar, finding his pulse. It was thready, faint. He is in stage 2 hypothermia. Approaching stage 3, Kaylin said, already calculating. His leg is shattered. If we move the ice without stabilizing the bone, the shock will kill him. If we leave him, the cold will kill him in an hour. Vance came stumbling up behind them, dragging Hayes. We leave him, Vance said. Kaylin stood up. She looked at the captain. What did you say? I said we leave him. Vance's voice was strained, desperate. The helicopter is going to be at the LZ in 10 minutes. We have a wounded man, our own man. We cannot carry 2 casualties, not over this terrain, not with a Cat 5 storm right on our heels. It is simple battlefield triage, Sergeant. The civilian is a liability. He is an American citizen, Kaylin said. Her voice was ice. And he is alive. Vance stepped closer to her. He tried to use his rank, tried to use his height. I am giving you a direct order, Rourke. We leave him. We get to the bird. That is final. Kaylin looked at Vance. She saw a man who had relied his entire life on algorithms to make his decisions. When the algorithm broke, he defaulted to the easiest path, the path of least resistance, the path that left a man behind. Her father had taught her differently. The Marine Recon Code did not have an algorithm for abandoning your own. I acknowledge your order, Captain, Kaylin said, and I am disregarding it. Vance's eyes widened. That is treason. That is a court-martial. That is tomorrow's problem. Kaylin stepped past him. She grabbed McAfee by the arm. Silas, get Vance and Hayes to the LZ. Put them on the bird. What about you, girl? McAfee asked. His dark eyes locked onto hers. He already knew the answer. I am staying, Kaylin said. I will stabilize Kepler. I will dig in. When the storm breaks, you send a rescue team. Rourke, you are insane, Vance yelled. The wind was howling now, tearing the words from his mouth. The temperature is going to drop below -70. You have no tent. You have no comms. You will freeze to death. Kaylin slung the M24 over her shoulder. She looked Vance dead in the eye. I know how to survive, Captain. You know how to read a screen. Get my patient on that helicopter. Now. The heavy thwack, thwack, thwack of rotor blades cut through the rising storm. The MH-60 Blackhawk was coming in low, following the terrain, fighting the crosswinds. It flared over the designated LZ, a quarter-mile away, kicking up a massive cloud of white powder. Go, Kaylin shouted. McAfee did not argue. He grabbed Vance by the harness, hauling him and Hayes forward. Vance looked back once. He looked at Kaylin standing over the broken body of the old scientist, the ancient rifle slung across her back. He shook his head and kept walking. McAfee stopped for a fraction of a second. He turned. He brought his right hand up to his brow in a slow, deliberate salute, an acknowledgement from one generation of iron to another. Kaylin returned it. Then she turned her back on the helicopter, turning her face into the teeth of the approaching blizzard. The sound of the helicopter engines spooled up. It lifted off, fighting for altitude against the downdrafts. Within seconds, it was swallowed by the whiteout. Kaylin was alone. Alone with an old man, a broken leg, and a storm that was about to erase the world. She went to work. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. Emotion was a waste of caloric energy. She operated on pure, distilled discipline. First, the ice slab. She used her entrenching tool to lever the heavy block of frozen earth off Kepler's leg. The old man groaned, his eyes fluttering open. They were clouded with confusion and pain. Hold on, Doc, Kaylin said. Her voice was loud to cut through the wind. I have you. She applied a splint using the handles of her ski poles and several rolls of cohesive bandage. She did not bother with painkillers. The cold had numbed him, and the drugs would slow his already depressed heart rate. Next was the shelter. She could not carry him. They had to go to ground. She found a deep snowdrift against the leeward side of the ice wall. It offered natural protection from the prevailing north wind. She began to dig. Snow caves are a specific architecture, a science. Too wide and the body heat dissipates. Too shallow and the wind rips the roof off. Too deep and carbon dioxide pooling suffocates you in your sleep. She dug a trench. 3 feet down into the hardpack. She angled the floor slightly upward so the coldest air would pool away from their bodies. She carved a small ventilation hole near the top. Her shoulders burned. Her lungs ached. The temperature was dropping so fast she could feel the moisture in her nose freezing with every inhale. She dragged Kepler into the trench. It was tight. It was meant to be. Now came the hardest decision, the math of thermal transfer. Kepler was dying. His core temperature was dropping below 90 degrees. He was no longer shivering. That was the final warning sign. The body was giving up. Kaylin opened her pack. She pulled out the emergency foil blanket. She wrapped it around him. It was not enough. She pulled out her chemical heat packs. She cracked them, placing them under his armpits and in his groin, where the major arteries ran close to the surface. It was still not enough. Kaylin unzipped her heavy outer parka. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing her body heat instantly. She did not stop. She stripped off her mid-weight fleece layer. She folded it tightly and placed it over Kepler's chest, under the foil blanket. She zipped her outer parka back up. She was now wearing nothing but a base layer and the shell. She had given the old man her insulation. She had given him her heat. She arranged herself beside him in the narrow ice coffin. She lay the M24 rifle down along her right side, keeping the action protected from the snow. The steel of the weapon was so cold it burned to touch, but she kept her hand resting on the wooden stock. It was her anchor. It was the only piece of her father she had left. She pulled the snow roof over them, sealing the trench. The world went dark. Completely, utterly black. The howling of the blizzard was muffled by the snow, turning into a low, relentless roar. It was the sound of a freight train driving endlessly over their heads. Kaylin lay in the dark. She listened to Kepler's shallow, ragged breathing. She listened to her own heart rate. The cold began its slow, methodical invasion. It started in her toes, a dull ache that slowly faded into absolute numbness. Then her fingers, then the tips of her ears. She knew the stages. She was a medic. She knew exactly what her body was doing. Her circulatory system was constricting the blood vessels in her extremities, sacrificing her limbs to keep her vital organs warm. It was a brutal, pragmatic defense mechanism. She had to keep her mind active. If she fell asleep, she would die. The cold would simply turn off the switch, and she would fade into the ice. She began to recite the Marine Corps history, the battles, Belleau Wood, Iwo Jima, Chosin Reservoir. She recited the names of the men her father had served with, the men who had died in the sand of Kuwait. When that was done, she began to calculate. She ran the ballistics formulas in her head. A 175-grain bullet, muzzle velocity 2,600 feet per second, target at 1,000 yards, 10-degree temperature, 20-degree temperature. She built entire firing solutions in the blackness of the trench. She visualized the reticle. She visualized the wind. Hour 6. The pain in her extremities vanished completely. This was dangerous. This meant the tissue was freezing solid. Frostbite. She forced her fingers to move, opening and closing her fists against the wooden stock of the rifle. Hour 12. The shivering stopped. Her core temperature was dropping. The brain fog began to roll in. The creeping, seductive lethargy that told her it would be so easy just to close her eyes. Just for a minute. Don't you quit. The voice in her head was not her own. It was deep. It was uncompromising. It was the voice of a man who had walked out of hell on his own 2 feet. Jonathan Lockwood. You do not quit until the blood stops. You do not surrender the ground. You hold the line. Kaylin forced her eyes wide open in the dark. I hold the line, she whispered. Her lips were numb. The words sounded slurred. She reached over and felt Kepler's chest. He was still breathing. The heat packs in her fleece were doing their job. She was slowly dying so that he could live. It was a trade she accepted. Hour 20. The silence changed. The roar of the wind above them lessened slightly. The blizzard was shifting, but with the dropping of the wind came the absolute plunge in temperature. The thermometer on her watch read -71 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a cold that defied description. It felt like breathing ground glass. It felt like the marrow in her bones was turning to lead. Hour 24. Kaylin was hallucinating. She saw her father sitting at the kitchen table in Montana, cleaning the bolt of the M24. He was looking at her. He was nodding. She saw Vance's face, arrogant and fearful. She saw the snow falling inside the trench. Focus, she told herself. The word was a heavy stone she had to lift. Focus. Hour 30. She could no longer feel her legs. Her left hand was a block of wood. Her right hand remained locked around the grip of the rifle. It was the only part of her that still felt connected to reality. The weapon was a conduit. It channeled her will to live. Then she heard it. It was not the wind. It was a vibration. A rhythmic crunching sound transmitted through the ice directly into her skull. Footsteps. Heavy boots walking on packed snow. Kaylin's military brain fought through the fog of hypothermia. Rescue. Unlikely. The weather window had not opened yet. McAfee would not risk a team until the sky cleared. If it was not rescue, it was the enemy. The Red Wolves. They had swept the valley. They were looking for the bodies. They were looking for the sniper who had killed 2 of their men with a relic. The footsteps stopped directly above the trench. Kaylin heard a muffled voice. Russian. Guttural. They were speaking through heavy, cold-weather masks. A beep. Then another beep. They had thermal scanners, or ground-penetrating radar. The EMP field must have dropped, or they were using hardened equipment. They had found the anomaly under the snow. A metal rod slammed into the ice above her, probing the depth. It missed her face by inches. Kaylin Rourke could not walk. She could barely move her left arm. Her core temperature was borderline fatal. But the combat medic was gone. The frightened girl was gone. All that remained in the ice trench was the daughter of a Force Recon Marine, holding a weapon that had never failed her. She used her right hand, slowly, agonizingly slowly. She maneuvered the M24. She could not bring it to her shoulder. The trench was too small. She angled the barrel upward, pointing it blindly at the roof of the snow cave, directly where the metal rod had pierced. She pushed the safety off with her thumb. It was a loud, metallic click. In the silence of the ice, it sounded like a bomb going off. The voices above stopped instantly. They had heard it. They knew exactly what that sound was. Kaylin did not wait for them to dig. She did not wait for them to shoot blindly into the snow. She calculated the angle. She calculated the depth of the ice. She trusted the power of the 7.62 millimeter armor-piercing round. She pulled the trigger. The muzzle flash illuminated the ice trench in a brilliant, blinding strobe of yellow light. The concussion in the enclosed space was catastrophic. Blood ran from Kaylin's ears. The bullet tore through 3 feet of hard-packed snow, shattering the ice roof. There was a heavy, wet thud above. A body hitting the ground, a scream of pure agony. Kaylin racked the bolt. Her right arm operated on pure muscle memory, fighting the stiffness of frozen joints. The hot brass landed on Kepler's chest. She shifted the barrel 2 degrees to the right. She fired again. Another blast of light, another deafening roar. Silence returned to the surface. Kaylin lay on her back, her breathing shallow, her heart hammering against her ribs. She waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Nothing else moved above them. She had killed 2 men through 3 feet of solid ice, shooting entirely blind, guided only by sound and instinct. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Good shot, Kaylin." She let her eyes close. The adrenaline spike faded, leaving her more exhausted, more frozen than before. She had spent the last of her energy. The cold rushed back in, absolute and victorious. She did not let go of the rifle. Her fingers locked around the wooden grip, a death grip, a promise grip. If she died in this ice, whoever found her would know she died fighting. Hour 31. The darkness was absolute. Kaylin Rourke stopped shivering. She stopped calculating. She simply drifted. The Brooks Range had claimed her. Above the surface, the storm finally began to break. The wind died down to a whisper. The gray clouds fractured, revealing the pale, cold blue of the Arctic sky. The sun rose, casting long, sharp shadows over the frozen bodies of the Spetsnaz mercenaries lying around a small, disturbed patch of snow. The silence held, absolute, impatient, waiting for the next living thing to arrive. The human body is a machine that wants to survive. When the temperature drops below -60 degrees, the machine begins to shut down non-essential functions to protect the core. It stops sending blood to the skin. It stops powering the digestive tract. Eventually, it stops powering the conscious mind. Kaylin Rourke was dying in the dark. Beside her, Dr. Aldous Kepler was entirely still. His breathing was so shallow it barely registered against the heavy foil blanket Kaylin had wrapped around him. The silence in the trench was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a grave. Kaylin's eyes were open, but she saw nothing. Her left arm was completely unresponsive. A block of dead, freezing meat attached to her shoulder. Her right hand remained locked around the wooden grip of her father's M24 sniper rifle. The steel of the weapon was biting through her glove, leaching the last fractions of a degree of heat from her palm. She was drifting. The pain had vanished hours ago. That was the most dangerous sign. When the pain stops, the cold has won. The lethargy was a warm, heavy blanket pulling her down into the deep earth. It would be so easy to close her eyes. Then she felt it. It was not a sound, it was a vibration. A low, rhythmic thrumming transferred through the frozen ground, vibrating against the side of her skull. Kaylin forced her mind to focus. She dragged her consciousness back from the edge of the abyss. She turned her head, a movement that took agonizing effort. The ice crystals on her balaclava cracked. Her cheek rested against a hard, cylindrical object buried in the trench wall. It was cold steel, a pipe. Her military mind, battered and freezing, slowly assembled the pieces. Dr. Kepler had been found near a Soviet-era radar installation. This pipe was part of the old infrastructure, a conduit running deep into the bedrock, connecting to the main antenna array that had been buried under the snow for 40 years. Kaylin remembered her shattered tactical radio. She had shoved it into her chest rig after the fall. The digital screen was shattered. The microchips were dead. The battery was a frozen block of useless lithium. But inside that radio was copper wire. Captain Thaddeus Vance had mocked her analog equipment. He had trusted the satellites. But satellites look down from space. They cannot see under 3 feet of solid ice. They cannot hear a heartbeat fading in a trench. Kaylin's right hand moved. It was a jerky, uncoordinated movement. She unclipped the dead radio from her vest. Her fingers were stiff, responding only to the sheer force of her will. She smashed the plastic casing of the radio against the wooden stock of her rifle. Once, twice, the plastic shattered. She dug her thumb into the frozen circuitry. She found the primary antenna wire. She pulled. The copper wire ripped free, exposing the raw metal tip. She brought the wire to the exposed steel of the Soviet pipe. In the modern military, communications are handled by encrypted data bursts. Thousands of megabytes of information transmitted in a fraction of a second. But before the data links, before the digital revolution, there was the key. There was the rhythm. There was the code. Her father had sat her down at the kitchen table in Montana when she was 12 years old. He had placed a brass telegraph key in front of her. He had told her that technology fails, but a rhythm can travel around the world if you strike it hard enough. Kaylin gripped the wire. She struck the raw copper against the steel pipe. Tap, tap, tap. It was clumsy. Her hand was shaking violently from the deep, internal tremors of severe hypothermia. She forced herself to breathe. She forced her frozen muscles to obey the discipline forged into them a lifetime ago. Dash, dash, dash. She tapped the pipe. The metal-on-metal contact created a tiny spark, a microscopic arc of electricity, but more importantly, it created an acoustic resonance, a vibration traveling up the pipe through the buried antenna array and broadcasting out into the frozen atmosphere on a primitive, unencrypted shortwave frequency. Tap, 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 SOS. She did not stop there. She tapped her identification, ROARKE. She struck the steel until her knuckles bled inside her gloves. She struck it until the copper wire began to fray. She poured the last reserves of her life force into the rhythm. She was a Force Recon Marine's daughter. She would not fade quietly into the dark. She would hammer on the door of the world until someone answered, or until her heart stopped beating. 80 miles away, at the forward operating base in Eielson, the atmosphere inside the command tent was suffocating. The weather maps on the digital screens showed the Category 5 blizzard finally beginning to fracture. The red and purple bands of extreme low pressure were breaking apart over the Brooks Range. The storm was lifting. Silas McAfee sat in the corner of the tent. The old advisor had not slept. He had not eaten. He stared at an old-fashioned shortwave radio receiver he had pulled from his personal footlocker. The modern digital receivers were scanning the encrypted military frequencies, finding nothing but the dead silence of the Arctic. Captain Thaddeus Vance paced the length of the tent. He looked haggard. The arrogance that had defined him 48 hours ago was gone, replaced by a hollow, consuming guilt. He had ordered her to leave the civilian. He had gotten on the helicopter. He had left his medic behind. "The screens are clear," Vance said, his voice tight. "The wind shear is dropping below safety thresholds. We can spin up the birds." "To go where, Captain?" the flight commander asked from the planning table. "We have a search grid of 200 square miles." She had no beacon. Her GPS is dark. "We are looking for a needle in a frozen ocean." Vance stopped pacing. "We drop teams. We grid the valley on foot. I am not leaving her out there." "You already did," Silas McAfee said. The words were spoken quietly, but they hit Vance like a physical blow. The younger officer flinched, looking away from the old sniper's dark, uncompromising eyes. Suddenly, the old shortwave receiver on the table hissed. It was not digital static. It was the dirty, crackling sound of raw, atmospheric interference. Silas leaned forward. He reached out with a scarred hand and dialed the frequency knob, turning the squelch down. Through the hiss, a sound emerged. A sharp, rhythmic crackle. An electrical pulse overriding the background radiation of the storm. Dit, dit, dit. Da, da, da. Dit, dit, dit. The tent went dead silent. The young communications technicians turned around in their chairs, staring at the ancient piece of equipment. "What is that?" Vance asked, stepping closer. "Is that a beacon malfunction?" Silas McAfee closed his eyes. He listened to the spacing. He listened to the cadence. Morse code is like a fingerprint. Every operator has a unique rhythm, a specific weight on the dashes, a specific pause between the dots. Silas knew this rhythm. He had heard it in the jungles of Central America. He had heard it in the deserts of the Middle East. It was the rhythm of Jonathan Lockwood. "It is her," Silas said. His voice was thick with an emotion he rarely allowed the world to see. A technician frowned. "Sir, that frequency is dead. It is an old Soviet band. Nothing broadcasts on that wavelength anymore." "She is using the environment." Silas stood up, grabbing his rifle. "She found the old radar array. She is manually tapping the antenna feed. She is sending us her exact coordinates off the old military maps." Silas grabbed a grease pencil and walked to the physical map boarded to the wall. He listened to the crackling rhythm. He marked a red X on the topographical lines of the Brooks Range. "She is alive." Silas looked at Vance. The old man's eyes were entirely devoid of forgiveness, but they were full of purpose. and she is fighting. Spin up the birds, Captain. We are going to bring our girl home. The MH-60 Blackhawk tore through the breaking clouds, flying dangerously low over the jagged peaks. The sun was rising, casting long, blindingly bright reflections off the virgin snow. The temperature outside the fuselage was still 60 degrees below zero. Vance sat in the open door, the freezing wind ripping at his face. He held his smart rifle tight against his chest. His tactical screens were back online, projecting the topography onto his visor. But he found he was not looking at the screens. He was looking at the ground with his own eyes. He was looking for the disturbed snow. He was looking for a sign. There. Silas yelled over the roar of the rotors, pointing down into a narrow defile. Vance saw it, a dark anomaly against the pristine white. Two anomalies. As the helicopter flared and descended, kicking up a hurricane of spindrift, the shapes resolved into human bodies. They were wearing white winter camouflage, but the wind had stripped the top layer of snow away. Spetsnaz, the Red Wolves. They lay dead on the ice, frozen in grotesque positions. The Black Hawk touched down. The skids slammed hard into the hardpack. Move! Move! Perimeter! Vance shouted, leaping from the aircraft before it fully settled. The SEAL rescue team flooded out into the frozen valley, weapons raised, sweeping the ridgelines. Silas McAfee moved with them, his eyes scanning the snow near the dead mercenaries. He saw the hole. A jagged breach in the ice, rimmed with the black soot of a muzzle flash. Vance ran toward the hole. He dropped to his knees in the snow. Rourke! Rourke, can you hear me? Before Vance could reach his hand into the dark opening, the valley exploded. A massive, concussive crack ripped through the frozen air. The sound did not come from the trench. It came from the high ridge to the north. The SEAL medic running 5 feet to Vance's left spun violently, his Kevlar helmet shattering into a spray of synthetic fibers. The man hit the snow, dead before he registered the sound. Sniper! Vance screamed, diving flat against the ice behind the frozen corpse of one of the Spetsnaz soldiers. Take cover! Another crack. A heavy caliber round struck the engine block of the Black Hawk. The pilot cursed over the radio, the rotors whining in protest as alarms blared inside the cockpit. Captain, we are taking critical damage, the pilot yelled. I have to lift off or we are grounded permanently. Get out of here, Vance ordered. Orbit at safe distance. We are pinned. The helicopter lifted off, banking hard to the south, leaving the rescue team stranded on the ice floor. Vance pressed his face into the snow. He pulled up his digital optic, trying to scan the northern ridge. The screen flickered, struggling to process the extreme glare of the morning sun reflecting off the glacial ice. I cannot see him, Vance shouted. Distance. Give me distance. Silas McAfee was crouched behind a boulder. He did not use a digital scope. He used a pair of old, high-magnification binoculars. Northern Ridge. The notch between the twin peaks, Silas called out, his voice steady under fire. He is in a deep hide. He is using a suppressor and an anti-reflection device. I caught the powder disturbance in the snow. Distance, Vance demanded, trying to lock his smart rifle onto the coordinates. Silas lowered the binoculars. 1,150 yards. Vance's heart sank. 1,150 yards. In a crosswind blowing 25 miles per hour, with a temperature of -60. The enemy sniper was the commander of the Red Wolves. He had set up a textbook overwatch, waiting for the American rescue team to arrive. He was armed with a .338 Lapua Magnum, a weapon designed specifically to kill at this extreme range. Vance's smart rifle was chambered in 5.56 NATO. It was a close-quarters weapon. At 1,100 yards, his bullets would fall out of the sky before they ever reached the ridge. The rest of the SEAL team carried similar loadouts. They were outgunned, outranged, and trapped in a kill zone. Another round impacted the ice inches from Vance's face, spraying his visor with frozen shrapnel. We are fish in a barrel, Vance gritted his teeth. He looked at the hole in the ice 3 feet away, the hole where Kaylin Rourke was buried. He had come to save her, and now he was going to die right above her. Underneath the snow, the noise was muted, but the concussions were unmistakable. Kaylin felt the heavy thud of the .338 Lapua impacts vibrating through the frozen earth. She heard the faint, frantic screaming of Captain Vance. Her tapping had worked. They had come for her, and now they were being slaughtered. Kaylin's eyes snapped open. The lethargy vanished, banished by a massive final surge of adrenaline. It was the body burning the very last of its emergency reserves. It was a fire that would consume her, but it gave her exactly what she needed: clarity. She turned her head. Dr. Kepler was still breathing. She looked at her left arm. It was useless. The fingers were black. The wrist was locked in rigor. She looked at her right hand. It was still gripping the M24. Kaylin Rourke did not think about the pain. She did not think about the impossibility of moving. She braced her boots against the bottom of the trench. She shoved her shoulder upward. The snow roof was already weakened by her previous gunshots. It groaned, cracked, and gave way. Vance was reloading his useless rifle when the snow beside him erupted. He scrambled backward, raising his weapon, expecting another Spetsnaz soldier. A figure rose from the ice like a wraith. Kaylin Rourke crawled out of the trench. Her face was chalk white, her lips cracked and bleeding. Her eyelashes were caked in solid ice. Her left arm hung dead at her side, dragging uselessly through the snow. But her right hand was wrapped around the throat of the M24. "Rourke!" Vance gasped, reaching out to pull her down behind cover. "Get down!" "He is zeroed on us." Kaylin did not get down. She did not look at Vance. She moved with a horrifying mechanical slowness. Every joint in her body screamed as the frozen synovial fluid cracked. She dragged herself over to the frozen corpse of the Spetsnaz soldier Vance was using for cover. She pushed the dead man's rigid body into a makeshift sandbag. She laid the M24 across the dead man's shoulder. She could not use her left hand to stabilize the forend of the rifle. The weapon wobbled, heavy and unbalanced. Kaylin shifted her body weight. She dug her right elbow into the solid ice. She pressed her bleeding right cheek against the freezing wooden stock. She wedged the butt of the rifle tight into her shoulder pocket. She was using her skeletal structure, her very bones, to lock the weapon in place. Silas McAfee watched her from behind his boulder. The old man held his breath. 1,150 yards, Kaylin, Silas shouted over the wind. Target is elevated 80 feet. Wind is full value, left to right, 25 knots, gusting to 30. Kaylin did not acknowledge him. She opened the scope covers. She put her eye to the glass. The world narrowed. 1,150 yards. For a 7.62 millimeter bullet, this was not just a long shot. This was at the absolute ragged edge of the weapon's ballistic capability. The bullet would go transonic before it reached the target. It would tumble. It would be at the mercy of the violent atmospheric currents. A smart rifle would tell you the shot was impossible. The computer would refuse to calculate a firing solution with a probability of hit below 10%. But Kaylin was not using a computer. She was using a legacy. She looked through the reticle. The magnification showed the distant notch in the rocks. She saw the tiny black shadow of the enemy sniper's barrel protruding from the snow. She began the math. Distance, 1,150 yards. The bullet drop at this range, in this extreme cold, would be immense. Over 400 inches of drop. She reached up with her right hand, taking her finger off the trigger, and dialed the elevation turret. Click, click, click. She bottomed out the dial. It was still not enough. She would have to use the mil dots in the reticle to hold over the target in empty space. She put her hand back on the grip. Wind, 25 knots. The Arctic wind was a physical wall of moving air. It would push the heavy bullet laterally for the entire 3-second flight time. She aimed into the wind. She moved the crosshairs off the rocks entirely. She was aiming at nothing but empty blue sky, high and to the left of the enemy position. She was trusting that the wind and gravity would catch the bullet and carry it back down into the notch. It was a shot of pure faith, pure mathematics, pure discipline. Vance watched her in awed silence. He saw the stillness settle over her. The violent shivering that should have accompanied her stage 3 hypothermia magically ceased. For this single moment, her body was a perfectly stabilized firing platform. Kaylin watched the wind. She watched the spindrift dancing across the valley floor. She was not just looking at the target. She was reading the air between her muzzle and the ridge. She saw a lull, a momentary break in the gusts. She found the void at the bottom of her breath. Her right index finger pressed the trigger. The M24 roared. The recoil slammed into her shoulder. Because she could not hold the front of the rifle, the muzzle whipped upward violently. Kaylin absorbed the impact, throwing her eye right back down into the scope. 1001, 1002, 1003, flight time. The bullet traveled over the frozen valley, arcing high into the thin air, fighting the drag, fighting the crosswind, fighting gravity. Through the scope, Kaylin saw the snow in the distant notch explode. It was not a miss. The heavy Spetsnaz sniper rifle clattered down the face of the cliff, tumbling over the rocks, followed a second later by the limp, heavy body of the enemy commander. He fell from the high ridge and vanished into the deep snow below. The valley went dead silent. Only the howling of the wind remained. Kaylin Rourke slowly lowered her head. Her cheek rested against the frozen wood of the rifle stock. Her right hand remained locked on the grip. She did not move again. Vance scrambled over the ice. He grabbed her shoulder. "Rourke!" "Kaylin." Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was imperceptible. Vance ripped his gloves off. He ignored the burning cold against his skin. He felt for a pulse at her neck. It was there, faint, tread-like, slower than a human heart should beat, but it was there. Silas McAfee ran over. He looked down at the trench. He looked at the old man wrapped in Kaylin's fleece. "The civilian is alive," Silas yelled. "He is stable. She kept him alive." Vance looked at Kaylin's right hand. He tried to pry her fingers off the M24. He couldn't do it. Her grip was locked in a frozen spasm. She had literally fused with the weapon. Vance keyed his radio. The frequency was clear now that the enemy commander was dead, and the EMP source was likely destroyed. "Base, this is Vance. Target is eliminated. I have 2 critical casualties. Bring the bird down now. Bring it down right on top of us." Vance looked down at the young woman lying in the snow. He looked at the ancient wooden rifle that had just done what $50,000 of microchips could not do. "Hold on, Marine," Vance whispered, the arrogance completely gone, replaced by a profound, life-altering reverence. "Just hold on." 6 months later, Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. The air outside the windows was thick, humid, and extravagantly green. It was the kind of heavy summer heat that makes men sweat standing still. Inside the tactical medical training facility, the air conditioning hummed quietly. 14 students sat behind simple metal desks. They were young, Force Recon trainees, Navy SEAL candidates, Air Force pararescue jumpers. They were the elite of the new generation. They wore smartwatches, carried digital tablets, and trusted algorithms. At the front of the room stood Staff Sergeant Kaylin Rourke. She wore the pristine, pressed uniform of the United States Marine Corps. The heavy fabric hid the extensive scarring on her right shoulder. She moved her left hand to rest on the podium. The index and middle fingers were gone, amputated at the second knuckle due to severe frostbite. She did not hide the injury. She wore it like a badge of honor. Behind her, mounted securely inside a glass display case on the classroom wall, was the M24 sniper weapon system. The wood was still worn. The metal was still scarred. Beneath it, a brass plaque bore 2 names: Jonathan Lockwood, Kalen Rourke. Kalen looked out at the 14 faces. In this room, you will learn the protocols of combat medicine, Kalen began. Her voice was strong, commanding, filling the acoustic space without effort. You will learn how to use hemostatic agents, digital pulse oximeters, and automated external defibrillators. You will learn to rely on your gear. She paused. She walked slowly from behind the podium, stepping into the center of the room. And then, she continued, you will learn what to do when every single piece of that gear fails you. The young men in the desk stared at her. They had heard the rumors, the legend of the female medic in the Brooks Range, the 1,150-yard shot with a dead arm and an analog rifle. They looked at her missing fingers and realized the rumors were not exaggerated. Technology is a luxury, Kalen said, her gray eyes locking onto the students. A battery will die, a screen will shatter, a satellite link will be jammed. When the sky goes dark and the temperature drops and the enemy is advancing, a microchip will not save your life. She turned and pointed at the M24 in the glass case. Discipline saves your life. Willpower saves your life. The legacy of the men and women who stood on the line before you saves your life. The weapon is just a piece of metal. You are the computer. You are the machine that must not break. The classroom door at the back of the room opened quietly. A man in a crisp uniform stepped inside. He wore the oak leaves of a major on his collar, Thaddeus Vance. He did not interrupt. He walked silently to the back row and took a seat in an empty desk. He placed a notebook in front of him. He produced a pen. He folded his hands and looked to the front of the room, assuming the posture of a student ready to learn. Kalen saw him. Their eyes met across the room. There was no animosity left. The mountain had burned all of that away. What remained was a silent, unbreakable understanding, a respect forged in the absolute zero of the Arctic night. Vance gave her a single, sharp nod. Kalen returned it. She turned back to the class. She looked at the young, eager faces. She saw the arrogance of youth, and she knew she was about to strip it away, just as her father had done for her. Open your notebooks, Kalen Rourke commanded. Turn off your tablets. Today we learn how to do the math in the dark.